Morning, folks. Welcome back. This is the second lesson of Unit 6. We are going to finish this unit by Friday. That means that you'll have all of next week to work on the booklets and booklets and other stuff that I've presented to you, because Friday, the 12th, will be the last day that I'm going to accept any work in. So if you have stuff that you want to be marked, I would strongly encourage you to get it done and sent in as soon as possible, because June 12th is the last day I'm going to accept anything. And you don't want to have a lot of stuff that you could have finished but just didn't for whatever reason. So we're going to continue. We are looking at page 5 of the booklet, or slide 11 if you're following along the slides. We're at student activity 38, understanding internationalism. We're going to focus our question today on what issues exist around internationalism, because really internationalism is kind of like having a group of friends come over to your house, and you turn on Netflix or whatever sort of streaming site, and you say, okay, what do you guys want to watch? Some people will say something, some people will say others, some people will hate some things that people have said, some people will love it. So there's a lot of personalities to deal with. Same goes with internationalism. There are issues because not everyone agrees with each other, and everybody has a different point of view when it comes to issues. So they do arise when we try to bring countries together. So it's, again, we're going to look at the issues, and we're going to focus on things like the terms that I'm going to introduce. So the terms are peacekeeping, international law of the sea, and foreign aid. So these are the things where these sort of issues can arise, because these questions of sovereignty, who owns this and who owns that, things like who should be sent in, or who has jurisdiction to go into certain countries. These are the sort of things that can really spark some conflicts with countries. So let's first focus our attention on peacekeeping and internationalism. So when countries join the United Nations, and remember, all countries are members of the United Nations, they agree to support the actions of the Security Council. So if we remember from a few lessons ago, the Security Council has 5 permanent members: Russia, China, France, England, and the United States. And then it has 10 other members who are voted in and circulate out. The Security Council is the United Nations' most powerful decision-making body. Like I said, if one of those 5 permanent members vetoes something, it's stopped, it's dead, it's done. So we have seen in recent times this veto power used. The United Nations Charter requires all members to keep armed forces available for use by the Security Council. So every country will have their army. Actually, minus 2. I know Switzerland, and Switzerland has an army, but they don't use it for combat. But I think Costa Rica, they don't have an army. They have a police force, but they have no army. Anyways, side topic. Back on the main topic. Every country has its standing army, however large it is. They have to have a section of that ready for international use by the Security Council. With this power, the Security Council hopes to protect the collective security of all United Nations members. So if we jump back in history to Unit 3, when we talked about World War I, at the end of World War I, they had the Treaty of Versailles, and one of the things that came out of the treaty was the League of Nations. And then we saw in the 1920s and 30s that the League of Nations was a joke. The reason that it was so ineffective was because it had no sort of teeth to do anything about it. If they would have done the same sort of model that the United Nations has now, where members provide X amount of equipment and soldiers to be used in international things, crises, maybe we would have seen preventing of certain things. So when Japan invaded China, and when Italy invaded Eritrea or Ethiopia, if the international community could have sent in soldiers to support the Ethiopians or the Abyssinians and the Chinese, maybe we would have seen a different sort of shift in history. But obviously now we can't, because history is history. But the United Nations does have this sort of teeth that they can send in. Now we must differentiate. We must make the difference between a peacekeeper and a peacemaker. Peacekeepers are sent to conflict zones only after a ceasefire has been negotiated. Their role is to set up a buffer zone between the warring groups and to observe and report on what happens. The United Nations is not sending in soldiers to make peace, defeat one side. No, once both sides have agreed to a ceasefire, the middle is occupied by the United Nations to prevent conflict from starting again. Troops involved in peacekeeping missions must adhere to the following guidelines. So they do have rules that are set up, so when these soldiers do arrive in places, they follow these rules. Consent. Peacekeepers must respect the sovereignty of the host country. So they can't just go in and do whatever they want. Impartiality. Peacekeepers must not take sides. So like I said, if they're in the middle, they can't be sympathetic to one side and be aggressive towards the other. And last, self-defense. Peacekeepers may use force only in defending themselves. So for example, in the 90s, with the breakup of Yugoslavia, there was the Yugoslav Civil War. And there was the Serbians who had invaded Bosnia. The UN sent in peacekeepers. And these peacekeepers were not, they were impartial. Obviously, you have an aggressor, and obviously you have someone who has been invaded. But they can't show support for one and aggression towards the other. They were impartial. And that's an excellent example. Canada has done its job in setting up a peacekeeping mission in Cyprus, where they have basically kept the island of Cyprus, which is below Turkey, separated between the Greek Cypriots, or the people from Cyprus, and the Turkish Cypriots, because they don't like each other. So that middle ground has been occupied by the United Nations for over 30, 40 years to keep the peace in Cyprus. So that just shows you, if they follow these guidelines, they can have success. Now, there are sometimes failures. So most peacekeeping missions have been successful, but several failures in the 90s raised questions about the effectiveness of peacekeeping as a foreign policy tool. In 1994, the UN peacekeepers were again unable to prevent genocide. So this is talking about what happened in Rwanda. In 1993, the UN has sent in 2,600 troops, including 400 Canadians, to Rwanda under the command of Romeo Dallaire. Their mission was to ensure that Rwanda's two main ethnic groups, the Hutu and the Tutsi, respected a peace agreement, but in 1994 the conflict ignited and the Hutu started murdering the Tutsi. So, here we have it. The UN has sent in soldiers to keep the peace. But a year later, we see the two large ethnic groups in Rwanda start to go at each other. Dallaire had warned UN officials of the risk of genocide. He'd also requested more peacekeeping troops and permission to seize Hutu weapons. Dallaire's warnings were ignored and his requests were denied. One of the things that makes the Rwandan genocide very, very sadistic and kind of hard to process is that it was done primarily with the use of machetes. It wasn't like the Holocaust, where they had set up these camps and gas chambers, which it is horrible, don't get me wrong. But the Hutu were using machetes primarily to execute the Tutsi and the Hutus who were supporting them as well. So when a mass of shipment of machetes came into the country, the UN failed to recognize the writing on the wall. Although the peacekeepers did as much as they could, they were unable to stop the slaughter. Over a 100-day period, more than 800,000 Rwandans, mostly Tutsi, were killed. Because Dallaire warnings had been ignored, the UN force was too small and troops were forbidden to intervene in the conflict. So remember, that goes along the lines of the self-defense and impartiality. Sorry. The goal of peacekeeping is to end armed conflict and human rights abuses. Peacemakers are not limited in the same way as peacekeepers. They are not neutral. They may shoot to kill. Their presence does not require the consent of a country they are sent into. Peacemakers, essentially, it's a force that comes in to stop what was happening. So let's say, for example, if peacemakers were sent into Rwanda during this 100 days, they would have had orders to shoot to kill Hutus who were carrying out acts of genocide, and that would have ended it. But peacekeepers, it's more they're there on the self-defense side. So if you're really interested in this period of history, I strongly recommend the movie Hotel Rwanda. It's very well done. It's not from the point of view of the United Nations. It's the point of view of Paul Rusesabagina, who was he was in Rwanda. I think he's still alive, so I'll say he is Rwandan, and he tried to save the lives of the Tutsi and Hutu. But again, it doesn't really follow the lines of the United Nations. If you want that, Shake Hands with the Devil is the movie for you. So that is peacekeeping. Now, if we move our attention to international law and laws and agreements, we can see that internationalism, it has good intentions, but sometimes conflict arises. So international cooperation is essential when the national interests or foreign policy goals of one country conflict with those of another. To simplify it, if the self-determination of one is being pitted against the self-determination of another, we need a third party to come in and mediate. So that is where United Nations and international organizations step in. International law is interpreted by the United Nations International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, or the World Court. The World Court tries to settle international disputes peacefully, but some countries are reluctant to recognize its authority or abide by its decisions. So the same way that in cities and in countries we have courts, if two parties have a dispute, they take it to a judge, and he or she will listen to both sides and then make a ruling. The International Court of Justice is the same thing. It is in the Netherlands, in The Hague. It is essentially countries go there, or countries will charge certain individuals with things like war crimes. That is where recently war criminals have gone stand on trial. Very recently, I believe of 2 weeks ago, they found living in hiding in a suburb of Paris one of the people involved in the Rwandan genocide. So guess where he's going to go? He's going to go to The Hague and be tried for war crimes. So that is, and the reason that some people don't recognize it is because if you don't recognize it, then you really have no reason to be there. The second you recognize it, then it has legitimacy. So in some cases, this is because governments do not want to surrender the right to make decisions based on their own national interests. So if you agree to listen to the International Court, then that International Court's decisions and rulings they supersede. They are more they're more important, they have more power than national laws. And for some countries and some leaders, that is not cool, and they don't appreciate it. So one of the biggest bodies of law is related to the seas and the oceans. So the United Nations Convention on the Laws of Sea defined territorial waters as those extending 22 kilometers from the country's coast, and gives coastal countries such as Canada the exclusive right to control fishing, mining, and the environment in the area up to 370 kilometers from shore. So for a country who has a coastline, 22 kilometers out to sea is your territory. However, if it comes to things like fishing, mining, and the environment, 370 kilometers out to sea or from shore is your territory. The Grand Banks are formed by an underwater shelf that extend up to 730 kilometers off the southeast coast of the island of Newfoundland. So this is specifically to Canada. At one time, this area formed the world's richest fishing ground, but technological advances in the late 20th century led to overfishing, often by large European vessels. Overfishing reduced fish stocks and destroyed the livelihood of many Newfoundlanders. So here you have, according to international law, an area that should have been designated to Canada in terms of fishing rights, so the rights of the fishermen of Nova Scotia. However, you have international companies coming from Europe who take the fish, and it destroys the livelihood of the fishermen. So that is an example of when a dispute would come up. The Canadian government is working to support Canada's claim to control the entire continental shelf in this area. So it's an ongoing issue, because this sort of gray area will exist when two sides are now challenging over resources. Now it gets even more tricky when it's not just fish we're talking about, but if we're talking about oil. That's when we get that's when things get really interesting. So a good case study would be talking about the Arctic. So the importance of the Convention on the Law of the Sea was highlighted in the summer of 2007. Russian scientists have been exploring the Arctic for months to discover the extent of mineral and energy resources under the ice. So like I said, when we have fish, it's one thing, but when we find out there's natural gas or there's oil, then countries start to lick their lips a little bit. Then Russia announced that its expedition had planted a capsule containing a Russian flag 4,200 meters below the sea level at the North Pole. So essentially what they're doing is they're claiming this area for Russia. The Canadians, the Danes, the Norwegians, and the American governments challenge Russia's claim. Canada, for example, says that the water separating its Arctic islands are frozen most of the year. Inuit hunters spend most of the year working, even living on the ice. The government maintains that their activities have turned the ice into an extension of Canadian territory. So what the Canadian government is saying, because this water is frozen and it is solid ground for X amount of months, it essentially is a part of our territory, and it is used by the Inuit of the North. So if you look at the map on slide 19, you can see the border in the red is essentially what's known as the Arctic Circle. And you can see that Canada, Russia, the Scandinavian countries, Greenland, which is a part of Denmark, all really are a part of this. So they do have claims. But according to law of the sea, the area around the North Pole is in international water because it is located beyond the 370 kilometers of the 5 countries within the Arctic claims. So international law is saying that nobody owns this. This is international water. This international area is administered by the International Seabed Authority, which was established under the Law of the Sea. The Law of the Sea allows the 5 countries with territory in the Arctic to file claims to extend their domain if they can prove that their continental shelves are geographically linked to the Arctic seabed. So you can see the oceans are not just something fun to look at or a place where fish and whales and sharks live. It's a huge mess when we talk about international law and international cooperation, because we are not just concerned with what's in it, but what's underneath it. The seas and oceans have not been thoroughly explored. We know more about outer space and what it looks like than we know the bottom of our own oceans, which is quite interesting and makes you wonder why, but whatever. So you can see how international law and agreements related to this Arctic case study are very complicated, because these countries, if they get aggressive and if oil is ever found in one area, you will bet every one of those countries who has a claim to the Arctic Circle is going to do something. And the unfortunate and worrying thing is, will it ever escalate into sort of military? And my view is that when things get desperate, people get desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things. Anyways, let's move on to internationalism and foreign aid. So foreign aid has the greatest impact when countries coordinate their foreign aid policies. This internationalist approach involves both the countries giving the aid and those receiving it in making decisions about the most effective use of foreign aid dollars. This helps avoid delay created by debate over where funds should be directed. So if both sides kind of agree on what the money should be used for, before it's even sent, then there's no concern, and it goes into whatever it needs to. This little chart here, foreign aid, these countries are most generous. So we have the United States way ahead of everybody. I'm curious if that is the thing now, because in the recent trend of the United States president, Mr. Donald Trump, is to withdraw from a lot of international organizations. So I think a few months ago it was what was it, UNESCO, and now very recently it is the World Health Organization, which he has deemed a puppet of China. But now he's got a little bit more pressing matters to deal with, and that is the internal conflicts that have now arose because of the murder of George Floyd. But that's a separate topic. So we have Germany, the United Kingdom, France, basically leading the pack. Canada's on there as well. So really, these are the countries that are providing foreign aid. We do have a little bit of a Canadian spin on this and a Canadian influence. So Lester B. Pearson, not the high school, but the Prime Minister, who the high school is named after, who had a continuous interest in international affairs, challenged the world's richest countries to spend 0.7% of their gross national income on foreign aid. This is the 0.7% solution. Gross national income, or GNI, refers to a country's total value of goods and services produced by that country in a year. So basically, we can tell how rich a country is on how high its GNI is. Where was I? So far, only Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden have met or exceeded Pearson's target. Canada, interesting. Our Prime Minister is the one that did it, and we're not even there. Jose Werner, Canada's Minister of International Cooperation, believes that the country should focus on delivering aid more effectively rather than on spending more money. That does pose a very interesting question, and it turns into a very interesting debate, this idea of what should foreign aid look like? Should it be just a lump sum of money and here, do with it what you will? Or is it should be, resources, knowledge to build infrastructure? Because then you get this question of if you teach a man to fish, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. You teach a man to fish, you've given him food for a lifetime. So that's why this sort of debate over how foreign aid should look like. Because there's also the idea that the foreign aid, once it arrives in these countries, if the leader is not very, if he's corrupt, he'll take it for himself, he or she. And there have been examples of leaders of developing countries who have become extremely wealthy because they've been taking little bits of the foreign aid for themselves. So then that is a very interesting question. And if you do have an opinion you want to share with me, by all means, email it to me and I would love to hear it. But that is it for this video. We'll do the summary first. Sorry. What issues exist around internationalism? Well, I think one of the biggest things is how it should look like. Because we all have different opinions, and we are not leading countries with militaries behind us. This is the concern, is I think how it should look like. This is what the issue is. We saw that when it comes to things like foreign aid and peacekeeping, there is debate. But when we look at the case study of the Arctic, it's very much in international law set up by the World Court. But again, the interpretation of it is up for grabs. And that is what is the main issue with internationalism. It is the question of whose self-determination or whose position should be correct when it comes to dealing with international issues. So really, that is probably one of the biggest issues that exists around internationalism. So that's it for today. I will see you tomorrow for part 3, I guess we can call it. And then we'll be finished by Friday. And then all of next week, maybe I'll make a video on Monday next week just to outline a few more things for you. It looks like a nice day again today. Enjoy it, and I'll see you tomorrow.